2 weeks back, you were completely convinced the chemistry flowing between you two was real, and every signal pointed towards something genuine developing. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, it all came to a halt. The texts got shorter. The back-and-forth conversation dried up. Everything that once felt obvious suddenly felt murky. The person who seemed genuinely interested in you started acting like someone you barely knew. And in that exact moment, your mind does one thing with remarkable consistency: it delivers a verdict. I misread the whole situation. They were never really into me. I imagined the entire thing. I want to tell you up front that this verdict is almost always wrong. And by the time this video wraps up, you'll understand precisely why. I'm going to break down exactly what unfolds inside the mind of someone who retreats right after real attraction sets in, and it's not what most people assume. Then I'll walk you through the concrete steps for what to do and what to avoid if this happens to you, so you don't accidentally make things worse. I'll also unpack what's happening in your own brain while you're sitting on the receiving end of that silence, because that piece explains why this stings so much more intensely than it logically should. I'll share the story of a client I worked with whose experience mirrors this exact pattern in real life. After that, I'll give you the actual action steps to take, regardless of which side of this dynamic you find yourself on, because some of you watching are the ones left bewildered, while others of you are the ones doing the pulling away without fully grasping why. Pay especially close attention to that second half. If you've ever gone silent on someone you genuinely liked and couldn't explain the reason even to yourself, I'm about to explain it for you. Let's begin with something most people never bother to separate. Being drawn to someone and being equipped to handle that attraction are two entirely different skills, running on two completely separate systems. Feeling pulled towards someone happens instantly and without asking your permission first. Dopamine surges. Your focus narrows sharply, and suddenly this one person becomes the most fascinating thing in existence. That part of the process is almost entirely automatic. Tolerating what comes afterward, the vulnerability of caring, the weight of someone's opinion suddenly mattering, the exposure of being truly seen, demands something completely different from a person. And that depends heavily on how safe their nervous system feels with closeness, a sense of safety shaped years earlier, usually through family dynamics and past relationships that have nothing whatsoever to do with you. Here's the pattern I witness again and again. Two people meet. The chemistry is undeniable. For a few weeks, everything unfolds effortlessly. Then, right when things start meaning something real, one person suddenly retreats. The feelings never vanished, they simply arrived faster than this person's capacity to sit comfortably with them. And their nervous system responded the exact way it's engineered to respond to anything that feels bigger or scarier than it can process. It manufactures distance. Before diving into the mechanics, one thing needs clarifying. This pattern has nothing to do with gender. Regardless of what typical dating narratives insist, phrases like "he's just not that into you" or "she's playing games" are lazy shortcuts that let people avoid actually understanding what's really happening. I've worked with men who went cold on women they were clearly wild about, and women who did the identical thing to men who adored them. Whether you're male or female makes no difference. Your nervous system alone decides when something feels too close for comfort. And it simply reacts. So if a friend or some social media post has fed you one of those neat, gendered explanations, set it aside for the next few minutes, because the underlying mechanism is identical no matter who's doing the withdrawing. Let's get specific about what unfolds inside the brain of someone who suddenly goes quiet. Once attraction shifts from casual to genuinely real, when someone catches themselves thinking about you outside the time you actually spend together, or starts picturing a future that includes you, their amygdala, the brain's built-in threat detection center, begins scanning aggressively for danger. That danger isn't physical, it's the danger of getting hurt, rejected, or trapped. For a nervous system that learned somewhere along the way that closeness eventually exacts a price, genuine intimacy can trip the same alarm as an actual physical threat. This is where attachment patterns enter the picture. Someone who developed avoidant tendencies typically grew up in an environment where emotional needs weren't consistently met, or where independence was rewarded far more than vulnerability ever was. They picked up an early survival strategy, stay close enough to maintain connection, but never close enough to be exposed. That strategy once worked. It kept a much younger version of them safe. Now, years later, their body still runs that identical program the second things start feeling real, even while the rest of them genuinely want something entirely different. Researchers studying attachment refer to this as deactivation. As intimacy deepens, someone carrying these patterns will subconsciously shut down the very emotional systems pulling them toward connection. Minor imperfections in you that never registered before suddenly become glaringly obvious. They get inexplicably busy in a way that feels manufactured, and distance appears without any clear reason attached. Often they couldn't even explain that reason to you. If you ask directly, none of this is calculated, and it isn't manipulation either. It's simply a nervous system doing the only thing it's ever known how to do with something this big and this frightening, and it moves faster than conscious thought can intervene. There's also a simpler explanation sometimes at play, one that has nothing to do with deep attachment wounds, plain overwhelm. Attraction that builds rapidly can flood the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning and decision-making, with more intensity than it's accustomed to processing in real time. There's a psychological layer underneath all of this too, rooted in polyvagal theory, the framework developed by researcher Stephen Porges to explain how the nervous system decides, moment by moment, whether an environment or person feels safe. According to this framework, your body constantly runs a background scan called neuroception. It's checking for cues of safety or danger before your conscious mind even weighs in. Someone's tone of voice, how quickly they text back, how emotionally exposed a conversation felt, all of it gets scanned by a system that isn't waiting around for permission from your logic. For someone whose neuroception has learned to flag closeness as unsafe, real attraction can trip that alarm even while every conscious thought running through their head says the opposite. That mismatch, wanting someone while simultaneously feeling unsafe wanting them, is exactly what withdrawal is attempting to resolve. Now flip over to the other side of this equation, because if you're the one watching someone drift away, your brain is running a very specific process, and understanding it will save you a tremendous amount of unnecessary suffering. Attraction runs on dopamine, and dopamine doesn't respond most strongly to consistency, it responds to unpredictability. This is the exact mechanism behind a slot machine. A reward delivered on a predictable schedule allows your brain to settle down. A reward that appears, disappears, then reappears makes your dopamine spike even harder, because your brain works overtime trying to crack the pattern so it can predict the next hit. So when someone warm and available suddenly goes quiet, you're not merely losing their attention, your brain enters what researchers call reward uncertainty, and it typically responds by wanting that person even more, not less. This is exactly why withdrawal can make someone seem far more compelling than they did a week earlier, when the healthier response would actually be to pull your own attention back too. Your nervous system reads unpredictability as something worth chasing, even when chasing is the last thing that will actually help. At the same time, not knowing where you stand triggers a genuine stress response. Cortisol rises, the same hormone involved in fight or flight, and your brain starts working overtime trying to resolve the ambiguity. That's precisely why you replay conversations, reread old messages, and hunt obsessively for the exact moment things shifted. This isn't irrational. Your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do when something important suddenly becomes unreadable. It goes searching for information even when there's no new information to find. If your own attachment style leans anxious, all of this intensifies dramatically. A nervous system shaped by early experiences where closeness felt inconsistent or conditional is already more sensitive to any hint of disconnection. So someone else's withdrawal doesn't register as mild concern, it registers closer to full alarm. The instinct that follows is to close the gap fast. More texting, more reassurance seeking, more attempts to fix whatever went wrong, which is often precisely the pressure that pushes an avoidant person further into retreat. Two nervous systems, both doing exactly what they were engineered to do. Out of fear will usually respond with some form of honesty, even if it comes out clumsy or delayed, because part of them feels relieved someone finally said it out loud. That one moment is worth paying close attention to, it will tell you more than 3 weeks of guessing ever could. Now let me walk you through how this played out in someone's actual life. I'll call her Claire, and I've altered enough identifying detail that it can't be traced back to her. Claire had been seeing someone for roughly 6 weeks when she came to me, and by her account it was a genuinely great connection, long conversations, real chemistry, both of them initiating contact without being prompted. Around week 5, he told her, completely unprompted, that he hadn't felt this way about someone in years. 4 days later, he went nearly silent. Replies got short, calls stopped, and plans that had felt rock solid turned vague overnight. Claire's first instinct was the one nearly everyone experiences. He must have been lying, or he met someone else, or she'd done something wrong without realizing it. She combed back through 2 weeks of messages, hunting for the exact moment she supposedly ruined everything. By the time she sat down with me, she constructed an entire theory involving a coworker of his she'd met once at a barbecue, based on nothing more than the fact he'd mentioned a work project involving that team. That's worth pausing on, because it's exactly what an anxious, uncertainty-driven brain does. It refuses to sit with "I don't know." It manufactures a story, any story, because even a bad explanation feels more bearable than none at all. What actually surfaced in our sessions together turned out to be quite different. This man had recently come out of a long relationship where he'd expressed his feelings early and often, and it ended in a way that left him feeling genuinely foolish for having been that open. So when real feelings resurfaced faster than he expected, his nervous system reacted exactly the way it had learned to. It treated the sheer size of his feelings as the danger itself, slamming on the emergency brake before he'd consciously decided to do anything at all. The turning point for Claire wasn't chasing harder, and it wasn't a dramatic cutoff either. It was giving herself permission to stop reading his silence as a verdict on her own worth. What we worked on together, she sent one clear, low-pressure message, something along the lines of, "I've noticed things have felt different the last few days. No pressure to explain, just wanted you to know I've noticed, and I'm here." Then she genuinely redirected her attention back into her own life instead of monitoring for his replies. He came back 3 weeks later, and far more honestly than he likely would have if she'd pushed hard. I want to be clear, this doesn't always resolve so neatly. Sometimes people pull back and simply stay gone, and that's real information too. But the mechanism behind what happened with Claire is one I see over and over: withdrawal driven by a nervous system managing an old fear, not a verdict about the person on the receiving end of it. So here's what to actually do, depending on which side of this you're standing on. If you're the one left confused, understand first that chasing an avoidant nervous system almost always backfires, because urgency and pursuit are precisely the signals that confirm the very fear driving the withdrawal in the first place. Your job right now isn't proving your value through escalation, it's regulating yourself first. The anxiety you're feeling is genuinely persuasive. It will insist that one more message, one more question, will finally deliver the clarity you're craving. That almost never resolves things the way you imagine it will. Give it real time before interpreting it. A few days of quiet following a few weeks of closeness isn't automatically the end of something. Allow enough space to see whether this is a pattern or simply a moment. And when you do reach out, aim for clarity rather than persuasion. One honest, low-pressure message naming exactly what you've noticed is the strongest move. You're not trying to convince anyone of anything, and you're certainly not trying to talk them into wanting you. You're simply finding out where things genuinely stand. Next, rebuild your own life back into the center of your days, and treat this as far more than a throwaway suggestion. The more your time gets structured around waiting for a reply, the longer your nervous system stays locked in that stress state, which leaves you less regulated, less like yourself, and frankly less magnetic to be around, even in the moment you finally do hear back. Decide your own limit in advance, before you're stuck in the middle of anxiety, regarding how much time or effort you're willing to invest before accepting the answer someone's actions are already giving you. People genuinely wrestling with fear tend to return with more honesty over time, the way the man in Claire's story eventually did. People simply losing interest tend to stay quiet indefinitely. Both are legitimate answers. Your job is letting time reveal which one you're actually receiving, instead of deciding for yourself out of anxiety a week in. Here's one more practical exercise worth doing while you wait. Write down somewhere you'll genuinely revisit exactly what you were feeling and observing before the withdrawal began. It sounds small, but it matters enormously, because the anxious brain is notorious for rewriting the past to match its current fear, convincing you retroactively that you always sensed something was wrong. A written record from the good weeks becomes something you can return to, rather than relying on a memory currently being edited by adrenaline. Now, if you recognize yourself on the other side of this equation, if you're the one who tends to create distance the moment things start feeling real, this part is specifically for you, and I'm going to be direct, because you already know this pattern is costing you the very things you actually want. Start by naming what's genuinely happening the moment the urge to pull away shows up. In most cases, withdrawal surfaces precisely because feelings intensified faster than your capacity to sit with them. Say that to yourself in the exact moment, not something feels off about this person, but rather, this feels like more than I currently know how to handle. Practice small doses of honesty with yourself instead of the usual two extremes of fully opening up or fully vanishing. If a wave of intensity hits, you don't need a grand declaration, and you don't need to disappear either. A single sentence does the job. You can say, I'm feeling a lot right now, and I need a bit of space, but I'm not going anywhere. That gives your nervous system exactly the room it's asking for, without leaving the other person to invent a story out of your silence. Get curious, either on your own or with a therapist, about where this pattern originally started. A strategy that once made sense for protecting a 10-year-old from an unpredictable household, or a 22-year-old from a relationship that punished vulnerability, is very unlikely to still serve the adult version of you sitting across from someone genuinely good for you right now. And communicate your retreat instead of executing it in silence. Going quiet without a word still counts as an action, and it lands on the other person as rejection whether you intend it that way or not. One sentence telling them you need a little space, and that it isn't about them, can transform the entire experience for both of you, and it's usually far less effort than the guilt you'd otherwise carry from disappearing without one. It also helps to build a physical practice for the moment the urge to pull back strikes, something that gives your body somewhere to route that activation instead of straight into your phone or into silence. A short walk, a few minutes of slow breathing, or simply stepping outside before deciding how to respond to someone, these all help regulate a nervous system currently telling you to run. And a regulated body makes a very different decision than a flooded one. You're not trying to talk yourself out of the fear, you're simply giving it somewhere to go that isn't the relationship itself. If there's one thing I want you to walk away with, it's this: someone going distant after real attraction is not always a verdict on how they feel about you. Far more often, it's a nervous system managing an old fear that started long before you ever walked into their life, running a script that has almost nothing to do with you. That said, this doesn't mean patience is unlimited, and it doesn't mean every instance of withdrawal deserves the benefit of the doubt. Genuine disinterest and genuine fear can look remarkably similar on the surface for a week or two. The real difference shows up in what happens next, whether honesty eventually follows, or whether the silence simply continues. You don't get to control which one you're dealing with. What you do control is whether you spend the waiting period staying regulated and getting on with your life, or anxiously trying to win back someone who never actually left in the first place. And if you're someone who recognizes this withdrawal pattern in yourself rather than in someone you're dating, hear this part specifically. Understanding the mechanism doesn't excuse you from doing the work of changing it. Knowing why you pull away is the beginning of relating differently, not a reason to keep repeating the same pattern. The people who genuinely change this cycle are the ones who use the insight to act differently the very next time the urge shows up. Here's the truth that deserves to sit with you long after this video ends. Silence is not always a sentence, and distance is not always a verdict. Somewhere out there, someone is fighting their own fear right now, wrestling with feelings that arrived faster than their heart knew how to hold, and that battle was never about your worth. You were never too much. You were never not enough. You were simply standing in front of something real, and real things sometimes shake even the steadiest hands. So stop rewriting your value into every unanswered message. Stop letting silence author a story that was never true. The version of you that survives this, the one who stays regulated instead of desperate, who chooses clarity over chasing, who protects their own peace while still leaving the door open with grace, that version of you becomes magnetic in a way pursuit never could. And if you're the one who runs, hear this, the bravest thing you will ever do is stay long enough to feel the fear without fleeing from it. Growth isn't found in the running, it's found in the staying. Say the sentence instead of vanishing. Choose honesty over silence. Because the people who finally break this cycle aren't the ones who understand it, they're the ones who use that understanding to become someone new, starting right now, in this exact moment, with this exact choice.